to me, trauma is more around signs and symptoms. So someone who might have trauma, some telltale signs, anxiety, depression, panic attacks. And the other way that trauma shows up in our life is through difficulty with relationships. And I don't just mean personal, like intimate relationships. So obviously that is a huge component. But the other thing is just relationships with people at work, relationships with friends, not being able to have relationships or having difficulty in relationships, I think is a really core component of trauma. So yeah, your life can be going swimmingly well, but if you're having panic attacks, anxiety or depression, and there's no real reason as to why you're having anxiety and depression, it's probably trauma that's not being felt into. And I think the other thing is there's a lot of people are disconnected from their bodies as well. So they may just be going through life feeling really numb, but numbness or not being able to feel is a real telltale sign of trauma as well. We've disconnected from our body. Thing is a lot of people don't think that they have trauma. They're like, well, I wasn't sexually abused. I wasn't physically abused. So that we call that the big T trauma, right? And a lot of people haven't had that, so they don't realize they've had trauma. I myself didn't know that I had trauma. But when I actually went and saw a somatic therapist, she said to me, you have trauma. And I'm like, wow, I didn't realize that. And so trauma isn't just that big T trauma. A lot of the impactful trauma is actually little T trauma, which is just a continuous, ongoing disconnection from our caregivers. It's relational trauma. And most of us have had relational trauma because our parents aren't perfect. Our parents have got their own stuff that's been going on that they haven't dealt with yet. And so they're just not able to connect to us in the way that we needed. And usually that's the issue. And that's the stuff that actually is manifested in intimate relationships as well. And so this is where it comes back to going into relational trauma. That relational trauma with our caregivers as children is mirrored back to us in our relationship with our partner. Okay, so adult trauma, well, the thing with adult trauma is, yes, we can have an adult trauma in terms of a car accident, or we can be traumatized with the death of a loved one or something like that. But usually when we've had healthy attachment and we haven't had any childhood trauma, we can really kind of grieve or process that trauma and actually move on quite quickly. So when we've had adult trauma, because I do get a lot of adults who come to me and say, I've had a car accident, I've experienced this. But when we actually get into it, a lot of that comes from their actual childhood trauma. So we're never really reacting to the current moment. We're always reacting to a version of the past and how we perceive that past. So adult trauma, usually we cannot be traumatized as an adult unless we've had childhood trauma. So PTSD, we don't get PTSD unless we've had childhood trauma. So we're always looking into the past to see what's actually the root problem here. Belief system is your trauma. So I don't believe that we can actually do trauma work without working with the belief system, because when we are traumatized as a child, we don't have the cognitive awareness of what's really going on. We can't really understand what dad's thinking and feeling and what he's had going on in his life. When something's happening and we're not getting our needs met, as a small child, we start to internalize it as, it must be something I'm doing wrong. I mustn't be lovable. I mustn't be wanted. I mustn't be good enough. And it's those belief systems that affect us in our current life, and they will continue to be mirrored back to us until we heal them. So the belief system, I can go into the neurological side of it as well, but there is a neurological science to belief systems, but we have to heal those belief systems because they're just going to continue to play out and manifest back to us. But the belief systems, we cannot do trauma work, I believe, unless we heal the belief systems. I always tell my clients that the inner child is going to run our life until we become conscious to it, because all of our trauma happened in childhood. Therefore, I don't believe that we can actually heal from our trauma unless we heal the inner child within. And we all have an inner child. And the thing I love about inner child work is when I get someone in the inner child and I can see that emotion on their face, I know that they're healing. and that's really rewarding. But the inner child, you know, it will run our life. It would be in the driver's seat of our life and we're in the booster seat, but we have to really get the child into the booster seat and us into the driver's seat of our life. And we can only really do that by, one, becoming conscious to it, and two, going back and giving that child what they never got back then, and really starting to nurture ourselves and love ourselves. That's the inner child. It's so important. I really don't believe that we can heal our trauma unless we go to the inner child. So it's really the client that's healing the inner child. I'm just guiding and facilitating. But the inner child, when that person goes to that inner child and they start to sit with that inner child and they start to notice what the child needed and then give the child what they never got, they start to heal. So I'm facilitating. I'm just asking the client questions. What did that child need? What did that child look like? What did that child feel like? What was going on for them? And then, you know, starting to give that inner child what they never got. And sometimes, you know, with internal family systems, I can guide them and facilitate them on the unburdening process and so forth. And I'm really just guiding. I'm the guiding force, but they're the ones doing the healing. And this is where it's so empowering to do this kind of work, because that child, there's so much pain in there, coming into the body, feeling into the body, and starting to get an understanding of what happened to us, and then starting to become conscious to the belief system that we told ourselves when that happened to us. So for instance, you know, I might feel tight in the chest, and then as I feel into the chest and I understand that there's sadness in there, then I can feel more into, well, what was I telling myself back then? I'm not good enough, perhaps. So it's when we become conscious to them. So a lot of people are not conscious to their belief systems. They're running around in an unconscious belief. Some people are conscious to them, but it's becoming conscious to those beliefs. And a lot of people also become quite resistant to the belief system that they told themselves. And so that can be another piece of work too, is starting to lean into what am I really telling myself?